This is Tailgate Talk, presented by Tarpon Blue.
Let's take a ride. In this series, we're going to show you everything Texas and its surrounding southern states has to offer, right here from our very own tailgate.
We'll take you from life on the farm and the ranch to the big city lights. This is Tailgate Talk. Come along for the ride.
Welcome back to Tailgate Talk. I'm Darla Wallace, and this is wildlife biologist Nick Colby. He's going to tell us a little bit about what he does.
Thank you, Darla. So we're out here on roughly 50 acres in Guadalupe County that the landowner initially had his property in an agricultural evaluation and found it more suitable for himself to place his property into a wildlife valuation. So a lot of questions come up of what are the big differences in wildlife and agricultural valuations, and to get kind of down to the base of it, agricultural valuation is those landowners that are running livestock such as cattle, sheep, goats, that predominantly was the main stake for agricultural production in the state of Texas. And recently in the state of Texas allowed landowners to conserve resources in the state and move their property to wildlife valuation. So specifically what this landowner does is manage for wildlife resources and endemic species at the state of Texas to keep that same tax valuation on his property instead of having to run agricultural products. So specifically, like what we're looking at here is a hog trap that the landowner set up to eradicate and work to remove an exotic invasive species like feral swine on his property. So removing exotic species like feral swine, or hogs, what most people just call them, helps that landowner remove those exotic species and encourage new endemic native species to flourish on his property. So removing exotic invasive species is a technique that landowners can utilize to keep their wildlife valuation on their property. But not only this, a landowner has to utilize 3 different techniques, this being one of them, 2 additional techniques to keep wildlife valuation on their property. So what we're going to do, this is of course one of them that we looked at, eradication exotic invasive species like feral swine. Let's see if we can go find 2 others on his property that he's utilizing to keep his wildlife valuation.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, Nick, can you tell me a little bit about what we're looking at here?
So where we stand right now is an ephemeral creek that the landowner has within his property, and particularly this creek is ephemeral because it is very active during some times of the year when we have a lot of rainfall, and dry and not flowing at all during others. So what the landowner is doing, because you have such steep banks and you have a lot of erosion that goes on along this creek bank, the property next door, or all the property outside of the creek bank, is what we call riparian. So all that flooded land is actively being eroded every time this creek becomes very active and starts flowing very rapidly down this water channel. So because you have so much erosion, that the landowner can utilize erosion control as a wildlife management strategy to keep that soil in place and encourage native endemic species, grasses and forbs, to take place along the creek bank edges to limit erosion. So again, just to reiterate, a wildlife management strategy that landowners can use, especially if they have those very erodible areas, is do erosion control. Maintain your creek banks, maintain large oaks or large pecans or whatever type of hardwoods that's associated along those creek bank edges, and keep native grasses and forbs in place and don't overgraze along those creek bank edges to limit the amount of erosion that may occur during hard rainfall times.
Oh, okay, awesome. That's very interesting. Can you tell me what is the next strategy that you want to talk about?
So the landowner actually has a few other strategies that he's employing on the property. So let's get out of the creek bank and let's go look at a few others.
Right, awesome.
So Darla, what we're looking at here is specifically a landowner strategy that he's employing to provide supplemental shelter for migratory birds, and those migratory birds specifically are waterfowl. So what we're looking at here right behind us is a large pecan tree that has since died, but has been left standing on purpose for the purpose of a natural shelter or a breeding facility or a breeding location for migratory birds, specifically waterfowl. These snags that are left up are great supplemental shelters or shelters for migratory waterfowl, such as wood ducks, that will utilize snags like this and utilize holes within those snags, which are basically rotted out locations within a snag, to burrow in and give birth to young and rear young as well. Also, the landowner has left the other part of this tree down as well for the exact same purpose of waterfowl and other species, to provide shelter for those species to breed and multiply in natural shelters or supplemental shelter locations. If you actually look over here to our left, there are supplemental shelter boxes or migratory bird boxes for wood ducks that he's placed up on the property as well, for waterfowl, again, like wood ducks, to utilize as sheltered habitat. So those are specifically supplemental shelter locations that the landowner has put up to fulfill his wildlife management strategies for migratory waterfowl. Again, these are another type of structure or management tool that a landowner can utilize to fulfill his wildlife management plan and keep his taxes low in the wildlife valuation strategies.
Okay. So you do have one more that you're going to show me here in a minute, right?
We do have one more that the landowner is employing on the property. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So what we're looking at here, Darla, is a supplemental feeding site that the landowner has set up for white-tailed deer. Many people around the state already utilize recreational feeding sites like this for feeding white-tailed deer, other species, but in wildlife valuation, you can actually utilize supplemental feeding sites as a wildlife management strategy technique. So again, this landowner here has got corn feeders set up, utilized not only for hunting, but for supplemental feeding endemic species like white-tailed deer. Landowners also utilize protein feeding locations as well in adjacent to corn feeder locations to provide year-round supplemental feed to endemic species such as white-tailed deer, bobwhite quail, other endemic species, and game hunted species. He's also got this hog panel set up around this supplemental feeding site to restrict exotic other species, not what the feeding site is used for, from getting into the feeding site. So specifically, as most landowners do, they'll put up feeding sites, feeding pens around their feeding sites to keep feral swine, other species, exotic species, especially if they're utilizing livestock on the property, such as cattle, from getting into these supplemental feeding sites. So they're only being used for one white-tailed deer and other game species.
Nick, thank you for joining us on Tailgate Talk today. We really appreciate having you. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, can you tell me how to do that?
So our company's name is Colby Land Company, and we've worked with landowners all the way up to Lubbock, all the way deep South Texas, all across the state really, to help landowners, one, keep their properties in agricultural valuation, move their properties from ag to wildlife. Really just depends on the goal of the landowner. So the easiest way to get in contact with me is look us up on Facebook. Again, Colby Land Company is the company name. Or of course reach out to Tarpon Blue Real Estate, and they always have my contact information and are pretty go-to for helping landowners keep special valuation techniques on their land.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you all.
Thanks for tuning in today, and thank you to our guests for sharing their story.
Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on Tailgate Talk.